Welcome to Arts and Humanities Are Central. I'm Margie Morgan, Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, and your host for this exploration of the important role that the arts and humanities play in our everyday lives. My guest today is Professor Keith Lewis, faculty member in the Department of Art, who has been at Central since 1994, sustaining one of the only jewelry and metalsmithing programs, instructional areas left in the state. Is that correct?
That's correct. We're kind of dying like flies.
Keith, before we talk about your work and your hobbies, let's talk about your educational background. You got your undergraduate degree at Dickinson College, is that correct?
That's right, in Pennsylvania.
And you majored in chemistry.
Yeah, majored in chemistry and minored in geology.
Wow. And so did you ever actually work as a chemist?
I did. I actually went to graduate school in chemistry.
Wow.
And didn't complete a degree. It was a horrible experience. It wasn't me. And after that, I worked as an industrial analytical chemist for about 6 years before going back to graduate school for the arts.
And you went back to graduate school at Kent State University and got your MFA in jewelry and metalsmithing.
That's right.
Was that an easy decision? Was that
No.
obvious to you that that's?
No, I think it's this chance that people that want to go into the arts always take, because you know it's not a job security decision. It's a decision you're driven to because you feel like you can really make things that matter. And so I kind of set aside a pretty stable and lucrative career and took the chance. And always have felt really lucky that I landed in an academic position and could keep doing that kind of work.
Uh-huh. And speaking of your work, your field is jewelry and metalsmithing. Mm-hmm. What's the difference between these two areas?
You know, there's a lot of overlap. I think generally you throw metalsmithing in because it covers this whole other set of groups of things that involve small-scale metalwork. Things like hollowware and flatware design, vases and cups, and other small metal objects that aren't wearable per se. And so generally the terms are just used to encompass that whole range and that whole history.
And jewelry?
Including jewelry.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And do you work more in one area than the other? Or
rarely make anything except jewelry. For me, jewelry just seems like something really interesting to make.
Well, when I visit your studio, I see a lot of chemicals, and there seem like there's lots of principles and physics involved in what you do. So certainly your chemistry background seems appropriate. But I wonder if you think of yourself as a problem solver, much like a scientist is. Because we don't often think of an artist as a problem solver.
Well, I think one big misunderstanding about the arts is that they don't involve kind of deep technical knowledge. And most arts practices do. Most arts practices involve themselves with physics and chemistry, the interactions of materials, the handling of things in space. And so, there are a lot of analogs to engineering, to science, to other analytical practices. And so, yeah, an artist does set up a problem to solve, as you put it, and then you have to use whatever tools are available or necessary to solve that problem. And so, like, I encourage my students, for instance, in their basic and breadth courses to take chemistry, because I think it'll serve them in many, many aspects of the arts.
And so what kinds of things are important in your process as an artist?
I think
precision,
I think my own personal process as an artist is a little different than many artists I've encountered. Many artists that I know are genuinely and profoundly, almost obsessively driven to make. And the making itself is the justification for being an artist, and then the stuff that comes out of it has a validity that comes from that commitment, that process, that learning as things are made. I think the difference for me is I'm an extremely didactic artist. With very few exceptions, I've tended to make work because I had a very specific thing, usually political or some form of social commentary they wanted to make. And I thought the jewelry would be an effective way of doing that. And so for me, the goal comes a little bit before process.
And what about sequence and precision? Are these things, you have described these things as being important to you, and like one thing, it's important, the order of things?
Well, I think in jewelry especially, order and planning and sequence are absolutely crucial. It's something that is that I really work with students a lot on. It makes a difference whether you do ABC or ACB. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, especially in something as highly technical and as highly fussy and persnickety as jewelry, a change in the right order can mean the difference between a piece succeeding and not succeeding technically.
Now, this importance that you're attaching to precision and to sequence is also true about one of your hobbies that I want to focus on today, and that is the history and mixing of cocktails.
Yes.
Now, I have to say that the word cocktail itself has always been fascinating to me. When was this word first used, and what did it mean? What was it?
Well, there's all sorts of stories out there about the actual origin of the term, most of which seem unprovable. What is known is just after 1800 is the first published definition of a cocktail, which was in a newspaper in Upper New York State, I think. Mm-hmm. And it describes a cocktail as a mixture of spirit, sugar, water, and bitters, which are herbal infusions that were and still are often taken for reasons of health. Mm-hmm. It was an extension of mixed ways of mixing alcohol with water and sugar in the past, and so that definition goes on to call a cocktail essentially a bittered sling. Mm-hmm. A sling mm-hmm. being a mix of hard alcohol, sugar, and water. And that is the pure definition of cocktail as we understand it.
And when was this?
This is the very early 19th century.
19th century.
And there's one mention of the word itself that predates the 19th century by a few years, but it's not a definition, it's just a mention in a British newspaper. But this idea of the cocktail as this very particular thing has sort of metastasized and grown and changed and expanded a great deal over the years.
Now, is there a sort of classic cocktail that embodies this original definition of the cocktail?
Well, there's one that actually simply is that definition, and that's what we now call an old-fashioned. It took on that name in the late 19th century to actually refer back to those earlier origins of the drink at a time when cocktails are becoming much more elaborate and much more involved. And so an old-fashioned is a very, very simple thing. It's generally whiskey and bitters and some sugar dissolved in water, served with ice, generally.
Well, let's move to your house and actually look at how you make an old-fashioned, and I hope I get to taste the old-fashioned too.
Let's do that.
Okay. Keith, it's so great to be at your house amidst all this cocktail paraphernalia. And I'm so excited to be able to try an old-fashioned. So let's mix one.
Okay, we're going to start with an old-fashioned glass. And we're going to add some bitters. I'm going to make a mix of two types of bitters, Boker's bitters and Angostura bitters.
So would you always start with bitters? Is that?
For this particular drink, yes, they're always a component. The order isn't as important.
Okay.
Traditionally, I would use a sugar cube. But in this case, what I'm going to do to save a little time and get a little richer flavors, I'm going to use some 2-to-1 Demerara sugar syrup.
And did you make that? Or
I did.
Uh-huh.
I did just half a cup of Demerara sugar and a quarter cup of water brought to a boil and then allowed to cool. And then what I do is I add a little bit of high-proof vodka to keep it from going bad so that it lasts for a couple weeks outside the refrigerator. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some orange peel and I want to add some flavor of orange peel to this drink. And so I'm going to express the oil of the orange peel into the drink, and just to really get to maximize that, I'm actually
of the peel.
Exactly. I'm going to muddle that so that some of that oil really gets incorporated into this mix of sugar and water.
Wow.
That gets kind of mushed up and ugly, so rather than use that peel as a garnish,
take that out.
I'm going to set that aside.
Okay.
And now we're going to add some alcohol.
Okay. And what do you use here?
I'm going to use some rye.
Why rye?
Rye is very, very flavorful, and it's not a wimpy material, so it'll really stand up to the ice as it melts. It gives a big burst of flavor. It's truer to the origins of the drink because rye is an older form of alcohol, of whiskey here in the U.S. than bourbon, which we're a little more familiar with.
Right.
So now that I've got those essential ingredients in, I'm going to give it a good mix to make sure, especially that sugar is completely dissolved in. But this is still warm. So we want to cool this down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a hand-carved ice ball.
Oh my gosh.
Which I made for some clear ice that I froze in my home freezer.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm going to put that in, and it just makes a
That is
beautiful.
so beautiful.
It just makes a beautiful effect.
Is this done for aesthetics, or is there a functional reason to do the ice ball?
Both, actually. Aesthetically, it is really much more beautiful
It's
than
beautiful.
a bunch of
The
ice
light
cubes.
is-
But it also cools the drink without melting as fast. So
you
I
don't
can
water
take,
down your drink.
Yeah, so I can take a good amount of time to use this ice ball to cool down this drink. And so I'll stir it 30 or 40 times just to get that thing cooled down. And then as a final garnish, I'm going to go back to my orange. And I'm going to cut off another nice, generous hunk of peel. I'm going to express that oil onto the surface and around the rim so that you taste that as one of the first things you encounter. And I'm going to trim that peel and combine it with one of the other traditional garnishes for this drink, which is a good cocktail cherry. And I'm going to use Marasca cherries.
Favorite part of the drink.
These are very delicious.
Darkest cherries.
Yeah, these are delicious cherry. I think they're grown in Croatia.
Oh my goodness.
Now, some people will say
black.
that it's an abomination to put a cherry on an old fashioned.
I don't think.
But I love the look of the garnish and
Oh,
that
yes, it's beautiful.
little sweet treat after you
wow.
have a few
so
sips.
now I can try it.
Absolutely.
Do I put this in the?
Yes, in fact, you can use it to stir,
stir a little
and
bit.
make that thing a little colder.
Very thick and it burns as it goes down. This is perfect
That
for a
shows that it's
cold
working.
winter evening. Over time, the meaning of the word cocktail changed. How so?
Well, as I mentioned a little earlier, it expanded and changed a lot. If you look at early cocktail books, you see around dozen or so different categories of drinks. There were slings, there were juleps, there were sangarees, there were flips, there were nogs, there were cocktails. And even the distinction between some of these types of drinks are a little bit lost in time. And they all eventually became subsumed under this fairly expanded term cocktail.
And what was the difference between these and the original?
Well,
What got added?
Well, one thing that got added were a whole host of different modifiers that became available and were set into the mix. Absinthe, various liqueurs, various types of spirits, radically different types of bitters, modifiers like vermouth, which began routinely coming to the U.S. in the latter half of the 19th century. Vermouth is an aromatized wine, an aromatized fortified wine. A little extra grape brandy, a few infused herbs and spices, and it was the addition of vermouth to the cocktail repertory that really expanded the possibilities of what constituted a cocktail.
And then sort of mixing really became quite an art, and at some point how-to books got produced. When did that happen?
Well, the very first cocktail book was published in the 1860s by Professor Jerry Thomas. It was called The Bon Vivant's Companion, and this was the first genuine cocktail book, although there are some printed recipes that predate it. The bartenders were stars in the 19th century and sort of emulating what's happening now in a kind of a renaissance of cocktails. So Jerry Thomas was famous, like all over the US. He was flashy, he wore diamond cravat pins, he had heavy jewelry, he used a lot of showmanship behind the bar.
This was in the late 19th century.
Yeah,
The sort of
Jerry Thomas
heyday
died in the 1880s.
of the bartender. And what do you think is the most important cocktail book? Is there one in particular? You have a bunch of books here.
The cocktail book is the Bon Vivant's Companion. But I think the one that kind of embodies the romance and the kind of incredible sophistication of cocktails came quite a bit later in 1930, actually during Prohibition.
Do you have
and it
that?
was published in London. This is not a first edition. I can't afford a first edition. This is the Savoy Cocktail Book, originally published in 1930 by Harry Craddock, who was a British bartender who did a lot of bartending in the U.S. before going back to Britain after Prohibition.
Why is this book special?
Well, I think it's absolutely gloriously beautiful, first of all. It's probably the highest example of Art Deco book design.
Wow.
And it's also very comprehensive. It includes many famous cocktails that both invented by Craddock and that predated him. And it, in its physical style, I think kind of typifies the idea of what a cocktail is, this idea of sophistication, the sprightliness. Craddock was also sort of a quotable guy. He once said that cocktails should be small so they could be drunk quickly while they were still laughing at you.
Now, this was the 30s. What happens to cocktails during the Depression and World War II?
Well, you know, prior to the Depression, of course, in the U.S. you had Prohibition. So cocktails went underground in the U.S. and you didn't have these public figures. You didn't have this idea of the cocktail artist. You had bathtub gin. You had the development of recipes that obscured the taste of bad cocktails. But this idea of cocktails as something clandestine and naughtily sophisticated really set in at that point. And then, you know, after the war, after the Depression, after the end of Prohibition, of course, in 1934, you had the growth of an American suburban identity with Levittown and the boom that came after the war. And cocktails at that point in bars were rather disreputable. But they still had this kind of patina of sophistication. So what you had is the rise of cocktail books and cocktail practices and memorabilia and tools that turned cocktail mixing into a suburban practice. The cocktail party, the kind of classic 1950s cliche of dad mixing martinis while mom was in her little pink apron in the kitchen whipping up hors d'oeuvres, that sort of thing.
Now you mentioned the martini. One of the very first and famous deviations from the classic cocktail, the old-fashioned, is the Manhattan. So let's go again to your house and let's look at the Manhattan to see how cocktails evolved over the course of the 19th and early 20th century and talk about the ingredients of the Manhattan.
Okay.
So Keith, what's the first step in making a Manhattan?
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the glass that I'm going to serve it in, which is classic cocktail glass.
What a beautiful glass.
And we want to keep the drink cold. It's more refreshing when it's cold, so that we're going to actually take some ice and put some cracked ice into the glass and just let that sit and cool the glass for a while we're actually making the drink. And I could add a little water, which would make this cool even more. But even just letting a little ice sit there is really going to help clean things, get things nice and crisp.
This is better than putting it in the freezer.
Well, you could do that as well, but this is often very convenient when you're mixing multiple drinks. We're going to mix this in mixing glass.
Okay, first thing is...
I'm going to start with the Boker's Bitters.
Just one bitters?
Yeah, this particular bitters is really super bitter, and I think it complements well with the slight sweetness of the bourbon that we're going to use, because we're going to actually make
bourbon this time instead of rye.
We're going to use a bourbon Manhattan, and we're going to use some just Elijah Craig 12-year bourbon. It's a reasonably affordable, very delicious bourbon, perfect for mixing. I'm going to take about 2 ounces of the bourbon, And in the case of the Manhattan, what we're going to do is we're going to add a modifier
Yeah.
that enhances and
That's the
fleshes out
next
the flavor.
stage of cocktails from the old-fashioned.
That's
adding
right.
a modifier, and the modifier is?
Well, we're going to use a premium vermouth called Carpano Antica. It's a red vermouth, or sweet vermouth as it's sometimes called. It goes bad very easily, especially when it comes in 1 liter bottles. So what I do is I open it and instantly decant it in smaller bottles that oxidize less easily and that I can keep in the refrigerator. And I'm going to add half the amount of vermouth that I added to the bourbon, so 1 ounce.
Is this sweet vermouth?
Yes, this is also called sweet vermouth. Italian vermouth, sweet vermouth, red vermouth are all really the same thing.
I see.
I'm now going to add a generous amount of ice to this thing. Again, I'm going to crack some ice into relatively small pieces so it cools the cocktail.
No ice ball? No ice ball this time?
No ice ball, because this drink is actually served without ice in the serving glass, and so what we want to get it as cold as possible.
So lots of surfaces. You want a lot of small pieces,
That's
a lot of
right.
surfaces.
And we want to get it right to the serving temperature, and because there's no ice in it, it won't be diluted at all. So we want to make sure it's to the perfect dilution to make it delicious. And so we're going to give it a good long stir.
It's interesting that you say you need to dilute a drink a little bit to get it to be at a good taste.
Well, for instance, the world is full of people who say they don't like scotch. And a lot of times I think they don't like it because they don't add any water to it. They think it's like not macho to add water to scotch, but really
I've
adding
never done
even
that.
a few percent water to scotch really can open up the flavors depending on the alcoholic strength of it. And so partly it's just personal taste, what you decide to do, but I think people sometimes don't realize how much dilution can open up the flavors of a drink. I'm going to dump this ice now so we have our nice cold glass.
Right.
And now we can take our properly stirred and diluted Manhattan with a julep strainer.
Oh, wow.
And we're going to strain that, and because we haven't shaken this drink, you notice how clear and crystalline it is. If we had shaken it, it would have come out cloudy and be a much less attractive drink than it is. And finally, of course, because it's about appearance too,
It's fabulous cherries.
we have to garnish the cocktails.
It's
So
fabulous cherries.
again, we're going to use some Marasca cherries, these beautiful, sugary, dense cherries that have a flavor that can hold up to the cocktail. They look so beautiful. And they're like a little snack at the end of it all.
Oh.
And there
Oh my goodness.
is a
Oh, a
Manhattan.
real Manhattan, which I've never had. I've only had Manhattan with Southern Comfort. Oh,
Now, this is a proper bourbon Manhattan.
oh, that is so smooth.
So you
That
think
is-
it's different than the
Oh yes,
old-fashioned?
I think it's much more. It's smoother, and there's not viscous at all. There's no thickness, you know. And it doesn't burn the same way.
Yeah, because of course it has that vermouth, which has a lower alcohol level. It
Right.
mellows everything
Mellows.
out.
It's mellower
You can-
and smoother.
You can probably a
wonderful.
person could probably drink more of these in an evening than they can the equivalent old-fashioned.
Ah, no, this is wonderful, and these cherries are just a lovely addition.
Well, I'm glad you like it.
Well, it's great to learn about the Manhattan. I'm wondering if there were a cocktail named the Keith Lewis cocktail, what would it be and why?
I've tried, Margie. It's not as easy as it seems like it might be. There's a kind of a renaissance of cocktails going on now, and so there are these extraordinary drinks being invented, often with very specialized ingredients. So cocktails are sort of imitating the trends that have been happening in food the last 20 years or so, with the development of molecular gastronomy, with the creation of very sophisticated palates. And so the few times I've tried to come up with cocktails, I can't say I've been very successful. I think if I was going to target myself at coming up with a cocktail of my own, it would probably involve a fairly unusual spirit here in the US called cachaça. Cachaça is a type of rum that comes from Brazil. And I have some personal connections to Brazil, and I'm very interested in Brazil and its culture. And so, but cachaça is a famously difficult spirit to mix complex cocktails with. And so if I could come up with a good cachaça cocktail, I'd be very happy.
And that's because it's linked to your interest in Brazil. Also, it's a real challenge.
Yeah.
Now, are there some other? You say there's some a recent trend in cocktails of sort of very interesting mixes. Can you give us some examples of some ones now that are?
Well, there's a lot of stuff that uses new ingredients. So, for instance, there are new liqueurs out there. There's one called Saint-Germain, which is made from elderflowers. And so there have been a lot of new cocktails developed with it. For instance, there's a cocktail that was developed by Murray Stenson in Seattle, a very famous bartender who's in Seattle, called the Hot Charlotte. Oh. And it's named after a patron of the Zigzag bar where he used to work. And it involves gin, lemon juice, this Saint-Germain liqueur, and Tabasco. Oh. And so that whole idea of putting...
Can you get it now? Can you
sure.
It? Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where would you get this?
I'd go to the Zigzag where the drink was invented. The bartenders can mix you one there. A lot of them have become very, very complex. So, for instance, there's a molecular gastronomist named Granta Schatz who owns a very famous restaurant in Chicago called Alinea that specializes in incredibly elaborate food that uses extremely sophisticated, sometimes scientific techniques to make food, freezing things with liquid nitrogen, turning things into foam, creating aroma experiences along with eating, very decadent stuff actually. But he recently opened a bar, and they're doing things like serving drinks that are mixed in special containers so that the drinks can actually radically change flavor over the time that you drink it, because things are being infused, or because elements are dissolving, or because flavor elements are sealed in ice cubes. So it's reached this incredibly elaborate point of view. And I kind of like it and I kind of don't, because I really like classic cocktails.
Right.
I like relatively straightforward, spirit-heavy cocktails that do amazing things to your palate. I mean, the best example I could give is a wonderful drink called the Diamondback, which was probably invented pre-Prohibition, but it first appeared in a book in 1951. It's very simple: rye, apple brandy or apple jack, and chartreuse, which is a very herbal
very
French
grassy
liqueur. It's an extremely potent cocktail. All of those spirits, if you use high alcohol spirits, it ends up being a pretty potent cocktail, but it's just one of the most delicious things I know.
So you have quite a collection here of things on the table. What is this? Is this a mixing fork? What have you got?
Well, this is a cocktail spoon. So you'd mix with this, and this would be used for spearing cherries or other garnishes. There's a whole weird world out there of specialized cocktail equipment. I buy most of my stuff on eBay.
Well, speaking of specialized, I've always wondered: are there particular glasses for particular cocktails? This glass right here would be for what, for example?
That would be for instance, a Manhattan or a martini, a normal up cocktail. Now, we know the more modern martini glass, which rather than having this coupe shape, has more straight sides.
Right, angular, yes.
But an old-fashioned, for instance, especially an old-fashioned served with ice, would more likely be in an old-fashioned glass like this. This is a double old-fashioned glass, and I picked a really classic 50s design with this metallic coating on it. There are also like special cocktails that have been devised for particular purposes. Vodka is rarely new in the US. And the first really popular vodka drink was the Moscow Mule, which is a mixture of lime juice, ginger beer, and vodka. And it was traditionally served in these copper mugs called a Moscow Mule mug. And it's partly because the guys that invented the drink,
mule on it. Yep.
The guys that invented the drink, one of whom represented the Smirnoff company, knew a guy with a warehouse full of copper mugs that he didn't have anything to do with. And so this became a marketed and invented corporate cocktail that was marketed to the public.
This is so fascinating. I wish we could continue talking about cocktails, but I think we're just about out of time. I'm so glad that I got a chance to taste some of your mixing skills. Keith, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for tuning in to Arts and Humanities Are Central. We'll see you next time.